Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Free Press Live. I'm Michael Moynihan, coming to you from the freezing cold Free Press office and newsroom in Manhattan. With me today is opinion editor for Newsweek, Batya Ungar-Sargon, and today we're going to be talking to Michael Knowles about the future of social conservatism in the Republican Party, Rod Dreher about Netflix's new Virgin Mary film, and Geoffrey Cain about what the hell is going on in South Korea. But first, let's talk about Trump's embattled pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Hegseth is hanging in the balance this week as a sexual assault allegation has surfaced, among other questions about his alcohol use and infidelity. Batya, there was a story this morning, and let's start this way. There was a story this morning in the Wall Street Journal, picked up by a lot of people. And as a matter of fact, I was on Megyn Kelly's show. I'll give a plug to a show that doesn't need a plug, yesterday. And she said at the end of the show, she's a defender of Pete Hegseth, but I think that Ron DeSantis, this is her saying this, I think Ron DeSantis would be the great pick. And she made a case for it, which I sort of agreed with. And I said, So I wonder what she's hearing from Trump world. This morning, the Wall Street Journal reported that this is indeed possibly happening. There are people in Trump world that are, put out feelers to the DeSantis people in Florida. So on the way into the show this morning, I talked to a source very close to Ron DeSantis, and I said, hey, what's going on? I don't want to misquote him here. And he was cagey about certain things, but he said to me that he can confirm that the Wall Street Journal reporting is accurate, period. And here's the relevant part. Trump wants DeSantis.
So a little bit of breaking news here on our show at the Free Press. Apparently, Trump wants
This is according to
DeSantis,
somebody who is a very reliable source,
DeSantis.
very close to DeSantis, says this. Now, as we were talking before, we have to, put all the caveats out there. Maybe I trust this guy, or girl.
As the case may be.
I was just tricking them there. This could be them kind of trying to push something along. But here, what I know to be true from this is happening. These conversations are happening. As you pointed out, when I walked in this morning, the Trump people are saying that Trump is going to tell him to fight. Fight, keep fighting, blood on the ear, hand up in the air, clenched fist. This is a slightly different thing, though, right? I mean, the idea that Donald Trump is out there actively talking to Governor Ron DeSantis, who has been a rival in the past, obviously ran and tried to primary Donald Trump, did run in 2018. That campaign was made by Donald Trump, and they sort of did ads that were Trumpy ads. My question to you is, what do you think about this pick? And then we should talk about Pete Hegseth a bit, because as I said yesterday to Megyn Kelly, de-wokeify the military. This is kind of nonsense to me, right? You want to do that? Great. That's an afternoon. You can do that. Let's get rid of these people. Let's do this. The problem is it has an $850 billion budget, and that's probably an undercount. We need somebody that can go in there with an axe and a scalpel and say, look, what is this? This is a sinkhole of money. How do we make this department run better? My argument for DeSantis on this, whatever you think about DeSantis' politics in Florida, he is a very good administrator. Nobody denies this in Florida. When a hurricane comes, DeSantis is on it, and you can rely that everything's going to work. So I think in that sense, this would be a very good pick.
It's such an interesting point you make. First of all, so the question of, is this scoop accurate, or is this the DeSantis people trying to push him? I don't think they would do that at such a sensitive moment where Trump is clearly paying attention. Hegseth is hanging in the balance, which we'll talk about in a minute, whether he should be pushed through or not. So it is a really interesting moment, although CBS, as you mentioned, says that Trump this morning tells Pete Hegseth to keep fighting for confirmation as Secretary of Defense.
What the hell do they know? CBS.
Exactly.
Trump saying we're gonna have to shut them down.
Right. Like, who's talking to them anymore? I think what's so interesting to me about DeSantis' name being floated is that DeSantis did not campaign with, he was not invited to campaign with Trump. A lot of people felt that there was a snub there, not just to DeSantis, but to his many, many supporters. But what I think you're seeing here, and really throughout this whole, choosing nominees and the battle for them, even replacing them, is Donald Trump behaving in the opposite way of how his detractors predicted. They said he was going to be a bull in a china shop. They said we were going to see massive threats to democracy because he had nothing left to fear. And instead what you see is a much more mature Donald Trump who's certainly making statements with his choices, but then is willing to sort of reconsider when he thinks that people are not going to get through, not going to be appreciated. I think that this is Trump trying to appeal to the center and to really prove that he understands the mandate that he is given. Let's talk,
I will say that as the very Trump skeptical person here, and somebody who recoils when I hear him being described in any way as mature, I think there is, as every successful politician has to have, a bit of realpolitik in him. I mean, the idea that
there's a lot.
There's a lot, but I mean, particularly in this, that he's going to do recess appointments, do an end run around FBI background checks, et cetera. If you were going to do that and you're going to put your middle finger up to the to the senators, particularly Republican senators who have said, we have a problem with this, we have a problem with Pete Hegseth, and we'll get to that quickly, is that he knows that this is going to be difficult for him, and you don't want a wrong foot from the beginning, and you want somebody who's going to be a good administrator. The thing about not having DeSantis campaign with him is that the number of people that are within Trump orbit who have denounced him is about 90%. And some, so far as his vice president saying that he might be Hitlerian, and no, he said, I've changed my mind. And I actually believe that he has changed his mind on that. I don't.
And Trump is very forgiving.
And he's forgiving of that. So but on Hegseth, what do you think about this? Because we're a long way from 1996. And again, to reference my pal Megyn Kelly, because we were talking about this yesterday, she brought up something interesting, that attacking Pete Hegseth was Ann Coulter. And I said, well, there's nothing surprising about this. Ann made her bones writing a book attacking Bill Clinton, right? High crimes and misdemeanors, the Monica Lewinsky stuff. We've come a long way from Republicans saying, like, look at this, Bill Clinton, he is unfit for the presidency, to saying, like, I don't know, seems okay. I will say, just to be very clear at the beginning, I don't know the ins and outs of this. I don't know everything about this. So that is an enormous caveat. I don't believe the most serious allegation against him.
So let's go through the allegations. So the first is, I think, something that is established as fact, which is that he has repeatedly cheated on his first wife and his second wife when they were either pregnant or nursing at home with young children. I don't think that that's contested. So that's the first one, which is, we could say maybe
and you support a moral. That, is what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I just think of that like, I guess I can't run DOD.
All right. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Not that, but him. The second is that he had to resign from an organization for veterans because of repeated acts of drunkenness or inappropriate behavior, of basically drunkenness, and that he has been drunk on set at Fox News. That was another one of the allegations that surfaced last night from Yashar Ali. I think he had 10 reports. And the third is this Me Too allegation that he was at a resort at a conference, and that there was an altercation with a woman, and that she then went to the hospital. She did not report this as a sexual assault, but the nurse who saw her is a mandated reporter and reported the sexual assault. The woman then settled outside of court. I think it was about 4 days later, And no charges were ever brought. So let's go through these.
Well, they did investigate, and we can start at that one, because that is the most serious one. And the police did investigate this. And, Hegseth paid her out. He says it was a small amount of money. We cannot investigate this person. And when you say, like, well, this is the charge has to be investigated, yes, but at the same time, has this person done this serially? Are they somebody, I mean, what do we know the circumstance of this? I mean, he says that they slept together. She was there in the hotel with her husband and her children at the hotel when he says this happened. That's a he said, she said. The important thing, and much like the Woody Allen case, which kind of bubbles up once in a while, it was investigated. The police decided not to go forward. If that is not the standard, we are living in a very, very Orwellian place. That the accusation itself is enough to derail you. That is a very bad incentive structure for people who want to destroy people's careers. I, on this one, say it's a serious thing. FBI, all these people should look into it. But on the surface of what we know, It was investigated by the police, and they decided not to charge. The other stuff, I think, is probably the more serious stuff.
I totally agree with you. I think that this is not a Me Too situation. I don't think it came off credibly as such. I think this belongs probably more in the cheating allegations, right? So let's say that like there's two real buckets. There's the cheating and then the drunkenness. On the drunkenness thing, I have to say I want to join the voices of all the other, people who are on Fox a lot. I've been on set with him. He was nothing but courteous. In fact, he was very kind, definitely not drunk, very smart,
if he was drunk,
very
I'd be like,
professional.
This guy's awesome.
And I was on Gutfeld with him, where he was hosting for Gutfeld, and which is a fun show, which is a relaxed show, and he was completely professional. So that really does not ring true to me at all.
On Greg Gutfeld's show. I'm actually not joking. I think
so, Michael, it seems that you have actually done everything Pete Hegseth.
Yes, I am the real Pete Hegseth, America.
Okay.
I am. That should be my new handle.
So, let's talk about this, because I think we maybe have different views about this. I think the cheating is probably happened and is morally offensive, but shouldn't be disqualifying. His mother denounced him, but I don't see that as should this be can he do the job or not? And I think I am in the camp of, I don't know that we, in today's day and age, in 2024, do or should consider moral failings to somehow be disqualifying for positions of enormous power that have nothing to do. I mean, would I put him in charge of, some sort of moral, glad we don't have these, but, office? Probably not. But can he do the job? I don't see any evidence that he couldn't do the job or wouldn't be very good about it. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the evidence that he couldn't do the job has nothing to do with the fact that he cheats on his wives. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough question. I mean, what is the line? I mean, if there is this kind of moral bar you have to get over to work. I mean, obviously the Free Press doesn't have it. I'm just going to tell you that. No one looked at my background and was like, "Meh, I don't think you should work here." They were like, "Yeah, that's fine." So that kind of thing is like what becomes the bar? What is unacceptable? Right. And now I think it was a little too closed before. It was like, we would have people that were. I mean, remember who was it? A justice that was put before it was in 1989 or something after Bork, and it was like the guy had smoked pot and admitted it, and it was like could not be a justice on the Supreme Court. We have had conversations where the moral frame was so closed that we were like eliminating people who were qualified and would be great for the country. I guess one of the things that I think of, the behavior that you're doing yourself, are the people underneath you. If they did that, would they be kicked out of the service? They would be. I think a lot of these situations, they would either be sanctioned or they would be, like discharged or something. Because I did a story a long time ago probably about 5-6 years ago, about a former editor of the New York Times who turned out was a plagiarist. And she was teaching journalism at Harvard. And that was the question I asked. They allowed her to stay on. Right. If her students did that, they would be sanctions. That is kind of my thing. I think there is a moral frame that exists within the military already, and whether or not you agree with that, is that something that he could himself be kicked out of the service for? I don't know the exact answer to that question because I know there's variations of it, but I just think that Donald Trump doesn't need this pick right now, and particularly after the Matt Gaetz fiasco and the person that was tapped to head the DEA, who was run out by conservatives, who said he was a nightmare during COVID. He arrested a pastor for having something where there was too many people there. I think at this point, people will not remember this outside of historians and political scientists. It will be gone. We'll just say, Ron DeSantis is the head of the Department of Defense. And according to the person that I said this morning, that I talked to, that is what Trump wants. Do we believe him? I do, actually. I do. Is that what's going to happen? We'll have to see, but that reporting apparently from the Wall Street Journal is accurate. All right, in just a minute, Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire and the Michael Knowles Show will join us in the studio. First, here's a look at the latest episode of Honestly. Oh, I'm in this, where I spoke to Haviv Rettig-Gur, the great Haviv Rettig-Gur, about what's going on in Syria and Israel. Check out the full interview now on our YouTube channel, and we will be right back with Michael Knowles. Is Assad the better option? I know from an Israeli perspective, that might be an odd question because Assad has not been mean, somebody who's working with Hezbollah, and you have shares a border with Israel. I've looked into Syria from the Golan and just said, good Lord, this is how close everything is. But is it a stability thing that right now what you might get is going to be worse?
My sense, that debate is happening in the West, in the United States, in Washington, in Europe. That debate is happening in Israel.
Yeah.
And I'll just say my 2 cents. You can't get worse than Assad. You can't get more destabilizing than Assad.
And is that from the perspective of an Israeli, or is that regional, or is that from the perspective of a Syrian, or all of the above?
It's hard not to be an Israeli on these questions because they're so specifically focused also on but the case is very easy to make. The man killed 600,000 of his own citizens. The man sent millions fleeing all over the world. The man, in order to survive, brought the Russians into the Eastern Mediterranean. The man doesn't just serve at the behest of Iran. His father, Hafez Assad, was the only Arab leader, the only Arab state that actually openly sided with Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. And so the alliance with Iran, and it has to do with religion, it has to do with the Alawis being an old Shia sect, is old and consistent. And so Assad holds, now the Alawites are a minority in Syria, and the only way for the Alawites to maintain control is by setting different factions in this multi-ethnic polity against each other. So, for example, during the Syrian civil war, one of the things that the Alawite militias, it's the Syrian army, but essentially functions as an Alawite militia at various points, did was to purposefully commit atrocities against Sunnis. And the purpose of committing atrocities against Sunnis was to force the Alawites to hold to Assad's banner, because if Assad falls, the Sunnis will then commit atrocities against the Alawites. The only way to survive. It's a regime that survives by creating all or nothing conflicts within the country between the different ethnicities and religious groups. There is no imaginable destabilizing factor that could be worse than what Assad is.
All right, welcome back. We promised Michael Knowles would be here, and you know what? He showed up. He's a best-selling conservative author, the host of the Michael Knowles Show, which we were just discussing, the Daily Wire. He's smoking cigars with Karl Malone. I mean, I don't even know what the show is. And the book club at PragerU. Michael, thanks for being here. Can I start with something? We were just talking about Pete Hegseth.
Yes.
And, you know, there's a million questions you could ask, but what do you think about this nomination, how it's unfolded, these charges against him? And we just had a conversation about, you know, how we think about morals and public figures from Bill Clinton on to today. We've gotten a bit soft on this. What do you think, I mean, about the charges, if they're true, you know, just broadly, the divorces, et cetera? Does that bother you in any way?
Well, I think the divorces are pretty incontrovertibly true.
Yes.
I don't think anyone is accusing Pete Hegseth of not having been a little bit of a Casanova. Or,
including his mother.
Yes. Right, yeah.
Yes.
You know, which I thought was such a nasty report from it was the New York Times that leaked that, right? You think, airing out that kind of laundry, it was really, really nasty. But some of the charges, I think, are absurd. I mean, they're accusing the man of rape. I don't see any evidence of that whatsoever. I see a lot of evidence to the contrary.
Nor did the police, by the way, who investigated it.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I really like Pete Hegseth.
Yeah.
Again, I think he would be the first person to tell you, yes, you know, I've had a colorful past, and but look at me now. Look how I've reformed. I think Americans love a comeback story. I think Pete would be great for military recruitment, which was a chief job of the defense secretary. So I think he'd be quite good at it. Now, if you're saying, Michael, back in the 90s, you know, Bill Clinton's far more colorful romantic past, Bill Clinton's was such a big issue to Republicans, you'd say, sure, that's true, but politics is applying eternal principles to constantly changing circumstances. So one of the tricks in politics is you try to hold your opponent to standards that you yourself will not live up to. And I just think, given the present state of the country, you know, it's a silly argument to me. You know, we are where we are, and if Pete Hegseth's worst crime is having been, you know, a little more rambunctious in his past and having reformed later on, to me, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and so what do you make of this Wall Street Journal reporting today? As we said in the first segment, I was talking to somebody close to DeSantis, and they said, Trump wants DeSantis. And again, this could be a campaign to push Trump in this direction. Would you be happy with a pick like Ron DeSantis? Look, my argument here is, the de-wokification of the military. That's a good sales point.
Yeah.
And that's something that I am in favor of. I've done a show for many, many years about the nonsense of this stuff. But, it's also an $800, $900 billion budget, which I think probably could be slashed a little bit. And you need someone, I think he's a great administrator. He's done very, very well in Florida when it comes to, emergencies, when it comes to storms, et cetera. People trust him in that. Do you think that he would actually be, and I know that you support Pete Hegseth, if he were to walk away from this, do you think DeSantis would be a good replacement for him?
I think DeSantis would be great for just about any job in the country. DeSantis is an extraordinarily competent and intelligent person. However, when I see these news reports about how Trump secretly wants DeSantis, or they're going to push Pete to the side, or what, I think it could be true. But here's what I know. Mar-a-Lago is Versailles. There is a lot of court intrigue going on right now. A lot of people are jockeying for position. Now, we know that sometimes it's legitimate because we saw Matt Gaetz sidelined. So it certainly could happen.
Yeah.
However, I think as it stands right now, I have no reason to believe that any of this stuff is actually happening. There are a lot of incentives for people to be campaigning on all sides.
For sure.
However, one of the nice situations that we're in now as Republicans is with a few more eccentric names being floated for various positions. The picks have broadly been quite good. There are a lot of very competent people who are up for these jobs.
Who would you identify as eccentric? I want to see if it matches with mine.
I was surprised by the Matt Gaetz nomination, I would say, and that one didn't work out.
I want to appoint you to some diplomatic position for that response. I was surprised by it. Yeah, I was too. I was like, really?
They say the difference between a flatterer and a diplomat is that a flatterer lies.
Yes.
And a diplomat just focuses on the nice things.
Correct. Yes. It was very generous of you.
Well, we wouldn't be having these conversations about all these nominations if Trump hadn't won. And one of the crucial components in Trump's victory was the ways in which he reassured Americans, specifically Democratic voters or people who had been until very recently Democratic voters, that the Republican Party could be the party of the working class and really the party of the commonsensical middle. And while there were many ways in which he expressed that, one of the very important ways he expressed that was by sidelining the Project 2025 agenda very aggressively, sidelining people who, like yourself, believe that IVF should be illegal, people who don't believe that abortion should be legal. He took the anti-gay marriage language out of the Republican platform for the first time in 40 years. So my question to you is, if it is true, if I'm right, that Trump's victory and the future of GOP victories involve a crucial sidelining of the voices of people like yourself who are true conservatives, where does that leave you? What's next for you, or do you disagree with this whole way that I framed the question?
I totally disagree with how you framed it. However, I see why you would frame it that way, and I think it's a fair interpretation of what Trump has done. But I would say it's better to look at what Trump does than necessarily what he says. I'm not accusing the man of lying. I'm accusing him of being a good politician who understands when to lean in on a topic and when to pull back. So on Project 2025, for instance, can anyone tell me what Project 2025 is? I'm not quite sure.
950 pages and no one can, which is amazing. You could just pull one page and
it's
a talking point. Yeah.
It's a talking point. I mean, I think at the end of the campaign, the Democrats said Project 2025 would get rid of the infield fly rule in baseball or something. So what was it really? It was, I think a lot of Trump's sidelining of that was a little bit more of a turf war over the control of the transition, because so much of Project 2025 was about personnel. And so that's understandable for a campaign to try to keep control over the transition. But where does President Trump really have stark disagreements with the conservative movement? I don't know. Even on the so-called social issues, President Trump is the most successful social issue president of any of our lifetimes. The man appointed the justices who overruled Roe v. Wade.
But for you, let me just interview quickly. Is it for you, as somebody who these issues are kind of paramount? Does it matter if Donald Trump believes in them? By which I mean he appointed those justices.
Yeah.
In that, I mean, I never thought I would see Roe v. Wade overturned in my
nor did
lifetime, and I think most people in the conservative movement thought the same thing. And you see him, interviewed before the election about the Florida ballot initiative on abortion, and all of these pro-life people are like, what is he saying? I mean, my feeling on that is, does it really matter what he thinks on these issues, provided he delivers for people in the movement?
It matters, most importantly, what he does. And on the Florida abortion amendment, I think this is a great example where President Trump signaled that he might support a pro-abortion amendment. And then he changed his position, or he couched it, and he said, no, actually, that's too extreme. And notice that language he uses. Oh, this is too extreme, this is too far, this is too crazy. What he's speaking to is the common sense. I think that the campaign was broadly one of common sense. And so for me, I have, I think, a pretty consistent view on bioethics and life. I think it's just wrong and we shouldn't have it. Some people say we should have it up until the moment of birth. Those people are also kind of consistent. The people who are not consistent are the ones who say we ought to have abortion up until 5 weeks, but not at 6 weeks, or at 15 weeks, but not at 20 weeks. That seems much more arbitrary, and yet a lot of people are there. President Trump, in fact, seems to have views like that.
Yeah.
And so he's grounding his views on what seem to be the common sense. And the reason I think this is a good thing for social conservatives is I think the common sense is moving very much in our direction. So the one issue that most people can agree on right now, in fact, it's being litigated at the Supreme Court today, is that we shouldn't castrate little kids because of gender ideology. There are some people who disagree, but the majority of Americans are on our side. Flipped Virginia, red for Youngkin. It helped DeSantis in Florida. It helped Trump. The logic of that idea is going to roll back a lot of the social liberation excesses of the past half century or more. Because if you go all the way back to the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, you go back to second wave feminism even, I think the premise there was men and women are practically the same. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Well, if a woman and a man are practically the same, then the gay rights movement flows naturally out of that, because a woman and a man are practically the same. So why would you discriminate based on men and women? From that, the redefinition of marriage, I think, flows naturally. If a man and woman are practically the same, then 2 men and 2 women and a man and a woman are all practically the same. And if a man and a woman are practically the same, then why can't a man be a woman, or vice versa? And then here's the rub, because I think a lot of people went along with that and agreed. But if a man can really be a woman, why does he have to be 18 to do it? If a man can really be a woman, wouldn't that be true at 17 or 16 or 5 or 6? I mean, that is what the leftists are arguing here. But that went too far for people. I think the Democrats lost the common sense when they made that argument.
Yeah.
So I think if you start to pull on that string, I think you're going to unwind a lot more than just transing the kids.
Okay, so we actually know what Trump believes personally about abortion. He has said that he supports it for 12 weeks. He is very vigorously in support of exceptions for rape, incest, and mother's health, and he is very vigorously in favor of IVF. But to me, it's less important what he believes and more important the tea leaves that he was looking at. And I actually think that I don't agree that Americans are getting more conservative. They don't see the trans issue as the same as the gay marriage issue, which is why...
No, they don't. Not yet.
In fact, even Republicans, the majority of Republicans now support gay marriage. And when it comes to abortion, there's massive support. There's a huge consensus. Most Americans want it to be... They're pro-life, but they're anti-ban. And so when the bans have come up for votes, they have been voted down by Republicans, by people who are pro-life, because they would never get an abortion. This is what they would say, but they don't want another woman. They're not going to judge another woman. So I guess I would say it seems like there is this very moderate center that Trump actually reflects perfectly. He has a genius for understanding where the American people are at. And the left tried to overreach. I totally agree with you with the trans agenda. But it's sort of like the buck stops there. Americans are like, whoa, not that. But even when it comes to trans people, most people want adults, transgender adults, to have protections from discrimination in the workplace and in housing, and they want it nowhere near their children.
Right.
So I guess my question again is, what does a social conservative do with a country that is sort of, to the left, in the center, to the left, and now winning big victories for your party, but not on the agenda that you would like to see?
Well, I think you just keep pulling is the answer. Because when you say most Americans support transgenderism for adults but not for kids, I totally agree. That's true. But that doesn't make any sense. Either a man can be a woman or a man can't be a woman. If a man can be a woman, then that's true for everyone. If a man can't be a woman, then it's true for no one. If it's true for no one, we shouldn't deprive women of their legitimate rights in bathrooms and sports leagues based on this nonsense. And if it is true, then we should trans the kids. So I agree that most people are not thinking of this relatively novel issue in a perfectly coherent, consistent way. Same thing goes for IVF. IVF is a relatively novel technology. Very few people have the time or the interest to think through the bioethical implications of it. It's a complex bioethical matter, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a logic to it. So if we were to be in the 1970s, we'd say, look, most Americans support feminism. Most Americans even maybe support, I don't know, some liberalization of sexual mores. But they don't support transgenderism. That's too far. Well, it was too far then, but ideas have a momentum to them. They have a logic to them. And so I guess my hope, my cautious optimism, is that we've followed this idea of men and women being practically identical to its logical conclusion. The logical conclusion of that idea is transing little kids. I don't think that we've just stopped there. I don't think we freeze things in time. I think politics is constantly in motion. And so I think what we're beginning to see is an unwinding of some of those ideas and excess of the broader LGBT movement. I think there is greater public antipathy today for the rainbow flag in parades and things like that than there was 10 years ago. And why is that? I don't think it's because people are bigoted or whatever. I think it's because the LGBT movement has just gone a bit too far. Well, okay, now you're going to see a backlash. How far that backlash goes remains to be seen. So you're right, I don't think President Trump is going to ban IVF or do any of these things. But I'm not just looking 4 years down the road. The leftists who led the Cultural Revolution in this direction didn't just look 4 years down the road, they looked 50 years down
You're
the
saying
road.
you'd be willing to lose in the short term on the altar of like an agenda that's very unpopular right now, like banning IVF, if 30 years down the road you believe you could convince people to agree with you?
I'm going to add one thing to this, in that we are going to take a quick break because Michael Knowles is saying all these things that are driving America crazy, but they can't hear them because there's a bit of a mic issue. But we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. I don't know what you're going to watch, but I'm probably in it and I'm sure it's amazing. So we'll be back in 2 minutes.
You're doing a lot of talks with college students. One of the kids raises his hand at some point and he says to me, everyone on my campus is anti-Zionist. I can't, my friends aren't my friends, my professors are all anti-Zionist, I can't get a date. I said to him, I'm an idiot Israeli. What's an anti-Zionist? And the kid says, an anti-Zionist is someone who thinks Israel should never have been founded. So I said to him, well, that's a really interesting argument because every other Jew in the Eastern Hemisphere is dead. Is the argument that the Jews who couldn't get into the West as the pressure was building in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe and in the Arab world, couldn't get into the West because of quotas, because of immigration quotas and laws against them, that those Jews should have been able to get into the West? They should have had other choices other than to become Israeli? Is that the argument? Because I agree with that. If that's the argument, I'm also anti-Zionist. It would have been really nice if the whole world had opened their doors to these desperate refugees 10 seconds before their genocide. But it didn't. Or is the argument that those Jews should just have died? The Jews had been living in Baghdad 1,000 years before the Arab speakers got to Baghdad.
And there were 50,000 Jews in Baghdad in 1946, right? Or maybe even more.
In 1930, there's a poll or a census of where 25% of the city is Jewish. Yeah. In 1960, there's 0%. 0% of the city is Jewish. Okay, it was twice as Jewish as New York. And then 30 years later, it's 0 Jews, no Jews. Anti-Zionist, Arab nationalist Iraqi Jews had all fled. Imagine if New York City in 30 years doesn't have a single Jew left of any kind. Left-wing, right-wing, progressive, Hasidic, no kind of Jew concern. You would know something about New York. The Arab world empties out, everyone empties out. So is the argument that they should have died? In my view, and what I told this kid was, either your argument is history should have gone differently, in which case, I'm with you. It's a damn shame that Zionism turned out to be so prescient and correct. Or your argument is those Jews should have died, and then I would be able to sleep better at night. Well, then you're a genocidal asshole.
All right, we're back. Everything's fixed. That's what they tell me. Everything's fine. Michael Knowles is still here. We're still going to argue. Michael, let's pick up where we left off. this makes a certain amount of sense, but at the same time, I mean, there was never really a backlash against the gay rights movement, was there? In this kind of place, it stops here at the trans movement. In this election, it is a culture war election in so many ways. I mean, you have Joe Scarborough on the morning after saying 80% of people don't agree with the Leah Thomases of the world swimming against. And they have, and he knew this. He was telling people, it's like, well, you didn't tell us before. This was not on MSNBC before. But there seems to be a stopping point where people are like, you know what, this is too far. But I get the sense that you think that this is actually boomeranging in a way. Or is this just kind of stopping? That like, hey, the post-George Floyd movement was like, you got to post this square on your Instagram. And if you don't, you're basically George Wallace. The politician, not the comedian. That's a very different person. And that kind of thing was like, people were like, well, hang on. I don't like this judgment. I don't like being, if I don't support this movement, if I'm like, I don't know, is Derek Chauvin worse than George Wallace kind of thing? Is that it? Or do you actually see this as saying like, okay, here's an inflection point, we're moving back to what in your mind would be a more sensible place?
Nothing ever stops in politics. We sometimes flatter ourselves into thinking it can all just stop and it'll remain this way forever, but the one constant in politics is change. So I think this is why the Joe Scarboroughs of the world are so desperate to try to pause it here and say, okay, you know what, we went a little too far. No one likes Will Thomas, beating the girl, Riley Gaines, in swimming. So we're just gonna, can we have a truce now? We're gonna stop. But that's a defensive posture because they realize that the ideas that led to men, beating up women in boxing matches, the ideas that led to transing the little kids, but they have an internal logic. And so if you contradict that logic, I don't think immediately people are going to say, okay, and that's why we need to ban IVF or something like that. I think people are just going to gradually begin to rethink their premises. And so that's where, over the next 4 years, when President Trump says, look, I love IVF, when Republican senators say, I love IVF, a lot of people do IVF. I totally sympathize with people who do IVF. My wife and I dealt with infertility for a couple of years. I was very tempted to do it. I get it, okay? But that doesn't change the bioethics of the matter. And I think what you're seeing at the level of moral reasoning and at the cultural level now is you're seeing more and more people coming to terms with, maybe it's actually wrong to create babies in laboratories and purchase them and trade them and deprive them of their natural mother, their natural father, or to even seemingly sell them as commodities and rip them away from the only mothers that they've ever known, their surrogates, or to, maybe there are some issues with that. And I think you're seeing progress with this where the Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, just came out and said, IVF, it's no bueno. It's gonna be tough for people to understand this, but we need to start making that argument. The Southern Baptists followed the Catholics who have made that argument consistently since IVF existed. I think that's really where the momentum is, and that's not in favor of the left.
But I think what you're going to come up against is, there are huge differences between gay people getting married and raising children in like a beautiful, loving home, and then the idea of exposing children to dangerous puberty blockers. In the minds of Americans, there is a countervailing value that we hold very dear, which is the value of freedom and privacy and the right for adults, consenting adults, to do what they want in the privacy of their own homes. I mean, this is a conservative American value that
it's a liberal value and a libertarian value. But I don't know if
you don't believe freedom is an important to what it means to be an American?
No, freedom, I think, is one of the great blessings, maybe the greatest blessing God's ever given us. But freedom doesn't mean, I think, what the liberals say it means, or what the libertarians say it means. There's a modern notion that freedom is the ability to do whatever we wish. That's a very modern notion. The traditional understanding of freedom is that freedom is the right to do what we ought. And one way to understand this distinction is to contrast it with say, the freedom of the crack addict on the streets of LA. We call this the Hunter Biden freedom. Or the freedom of a man who's fulfilling his responsibilities and gets 8 hours of sleep and does a good job. According to the ability to do whatever you wish, Hunter Biden's the freest guy in the world, right? Back in the day. because as long as he has a buck in his pocket from Ukraine, he can go and buy some crack, and he can go purchase some hookers, and he's so free, isn't he? But no one thinks that.
That sounds pretty great to me. Can I say that or not?
But the Constitution, right? The First Amendment, the freedom of religion. These are freedoms from oppression, right? Not the freedom to do what you want, right? Those people are all Christians who wrote that. They thought you ought to be a Christian, but they gave me the right to be a Jew. And if I could just,
I just think this is an important distinction on freedom, because it really gets to the heart of where the liberals and the libertarians and the conservatives disagree. The heroin addict is not free. He's free according to the liberal and libertarian conception of freedom, but he's not free. He's a slave. He's a slave to his appetites and his base passions. True freedom is having your appetites be subdued by your reason, so you act in a reasonable way and you can actually flourish and survive and not die of exposure with a needle in your arm. Those are totally different conceptions of freedom. And so the freedom that we want is the freedom that's grounded in reality and in the truth.
And in the Constitution.
And the Constitution is a document that reflects certain truths and realities and establishes a frame of government. But this is why the question of can a man become a woman really matters, because you say, look, there's a huge difference here between gay people getting married, which is a concept that I think is actually incoherent. Gay people getting married and a little boy becoming a little girl, supposedly. But I don't really understand what the distinction is, because if men and women are exactly the same, then I totally understand the concept of gay marriage. But if men and women are exactly the same, or practically the same, then I also totally understand transgenderism, and you should trans the kids. In fact, I think transgenderism flows inevitably from the logic that brought us gay marriage. Most people support gay marriage, they don't support transing the kids, but to me, it seems like the same logic.
Yeah, Michael, we're up against time here, so we don't have time for me to tell you how wrong you are about freedom. I could do this for about 20 minutes. But I want to ask one more thing before you go. I mean, the ideas that you see on a show like yours, on Ben Shapiro's show, didn't get an airing, we could say, in the 1980s. You see Rush Limbaugh come in the 1990s, and there's conservatives that are exhaling and saying there's a place for us. Talk a little bit about the Daily Wire, because, I mean, this is an enormously successful enterprise beyond the fact that you have a show, Ben has a show, et cetera. You have a film studio, you do, a production company, et cetera. I mean, this has been a real change. I mean, it's almost like the Chitlin circuit, which is, famous amongst black comedians, or like, we're not allowed into these certain clubs, we were making our own thing. This own thing that exists for conservatives has been amazingly successful. And you guys have how many employees now?
250, 300, something
That's
like
insane.
that. Yeah, it's shocking, because it started in a pool house in LA with 3
Yeah.
people.
What do you think that success is? Obviously a mix of people, Ben, et cetera, yourself, Andrew Klavan, all these people that are on staff.
I would take all the credit.
Yeah. I was going to say it was you, and then I realized that would just be unfair to all the others. But why is the Daily Wire become this thing that is kind of the film studio stuff, this kind of replacement culture for a lot of people?
Well, I really have to thank the liberal media. This is the real answer to this. I was speaking to a prominent liberal network TV journalist the other day, and he said, Michael, you conservatives have done such a good job in the alternative media. Do you think the left will ever have that? I said, well, you tell me. You're the one at the network.
The answer is no.
The answer is no, because you already have that. It's called the media. So in many ways, it's the same thing as the free press. I mean, you guys aren't doing, Lord of the Rings yet or anything like that.
Not yet.
Hold on.
Yeah.
But obviously, the free press was a direct reaction to the corruption of the establishment media. That's how it's been successful. Same thing for Daily Wire. The Daily Wire, being a bit more conservative, probably just benefits from even greater corruption in the media, cast our way, and so a greater hunger among audiences for an alternative. And that alternative will be TV shows, movies, sure, but it's also razors, it's chocolate bars.
Yeah, the razors and cigars. Well, Michael, thank you for joining us. And I'll tell you what, that we might not be the same as the Daily Wire, and we might find your ideas about freedom to be totally insane. That's me. Libertarian as a slur. I'm just like shrinking. I'm like, I don't have time in this segment to attack. But we love having you on.
Yes,
we appreciate all points of view. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. And coming up next, Batya, not me, just Batya is going to speak to Rod Dreher about a piece that he wrote for us. And we'll be right back. Suppose if you're an anti-Zionist, that means you want the destruction of the state, because Zionism, in that sense, is a settled issue. It was settled in 1948.
Yeah, when you challenge someone and you say, what the heck's an anti-Zionist? You mean destruction? And then they say, no, God forbid, we mean a one-state solution for all the people.
No, that's
right?
the
A
same
civic
thing.
democracy a la the United States. That's really sweet, but you're arguing with the Jews who survived the 20th century that they should give up their self-defense because the Arab world can contain them. And when I said that, right, the Arab world will just treat the minority Jews okay. Why? Because they're so beautiful and wonderful and it's so great to live in the Arab world right now. And there isn't a massive crisis of modernity, and there isn't a massive crisis of political Islam, and there isn't a massive crisis of minorities on every turn dying and being destroyed. And then the response from a prominent Palestinian activist in Washington, D.C. to my saying that was, you're a racist. What do you think, all Arabs are bad? What do you do with that? What do you mean, what do I think, all Arabs are bad? Let's go throughout the Middle East and talk to every minority in the Middle East and ask them if they can take a vote by pulling that lever on whether they should have their own self-determination and self-defense. You will have 100% saying yes. I'm not saying Arabs are bad. I'm saying the Arab world right now is, excuse my French, a shit show. Massively dysfunctional. Dictatorships and genocides at every turn. Yemen just had a war in which 250,000 people starved to death, literally, including 85,000 children. And it wasn't 100 years ago. It was in 2018. And none of those college students gave a shit. So, no, I submit to you that I am not racist. In fact, to ignore that and totemize one specific conflict because it tells you a story about your own morality in the West, and ignore all the vastness of human suffering, to come out in defense of Assad while worrying about Gaza. If the worst case scenario in Gaza, that every enemy of Israel is right about Israel's absolute mendacity and evil, is still 1/10 of what Assad actually did, and Assad is okay? No, I submit to you that the Western moral left-wing discourse is utterly and totally compromised, and that it cannot actually challenge us because it's actually about something else. And we are figures in this narrative.
Is Assad the better option? I know from an Israeli perspective that might be a odd question because Assad has not been, I mean, somebody who's working with Hezbollah, and you shares a border with Israel. I've looked into Syria from the Golan and just said, good Lord, this is how close everything is. But is it a stability thing that right now what you might get is going to be worse?
My sense, that debate is happening in the West, in the United States, in Washington, and
Hello, welcome back. We are now very excited to have Rod Dreher here with us from Budapest, whose latest piece for the Free Press delves into the controversy surrounding Netflix's upcoming film Mary, which cast an Israeli Jewish actress to play the Virgin Mary. Rod, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you. This piece is a real tour de force. I'm going to read a few lines from it and then have you just walk us through the argument. So you write, "Let us stop and consider what a stupid time we live in. It's an era where people are losing their minds with hatred over the fact that a Jewish actress was cast to play a Jewish woman. Think about that," you write. "Then again, anti-Semitism has never been about actual Jews, has it? Like a boil on the backside of the body politic," writes the great Rod Dreher, "there has been an ugly eruption of Jew-hating foolishness over casting in the upcoming Netflix film Mary about the life of Jesus' mother. People are outraged that director DJ Caruso cast an Israeli Jew, Noah Cohen, to play the title character." Rod, what inspired you to write this wonderful piece?
Well, it's just outrageous what's happening. I mean, I'm a Christian. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And, this is my religion they're talking about, these people who are trying to de-Judaize Christianity for the sake of winning arguments for the Palestinian cause. And the thing is, Batya, this has happened before. It happened right near the very beginning of Christianity. In the 2nd century, there was a theologian called Marcion, who thought that there was nothing to do with the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. He said that the God of the Hebrew Bible was mean and violent, and we had to get rid of him. So Marcion wrote his own Bible. He kicked out the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, and all that, and it made its own selective picking out of New Testament books. Well, this was criticized and condemned as a heresy by the church fathers. We dealt with this in the 2nd century, but it's back now, and it's back for the stupidest reasons. It's back because the Palestinians want to get a propaganda victory, and they think that by appealing to American Christians who may not understand anything about our own church history, that they can do that. And you know what? They might actually get somewhere with it, because so many American Christians are blindly ignorant of church history and don't realize that this is an ancient heresy.
You do such a great job in the piece of really describing this sort of horseshoe of anti-Semitism, how the same emotions are percolating on the left and on the right. Can you please walk us through that?
Sure. I always thought, or have thought in recent years, that anti-Semitism was a left-wing problem, despite the fact that, we all know about the radical right. And we've seen it all happen on college campuses since October 7th. But now you have people like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens. I used to respect her, but now she's gone online putting out these blood libels against the Jews, saying they kidnapped Christian babies and so forth. The fact that you now get this in these edgelord forums on the online right is really disturbing, especially because it's happening in a time and in a place, the United States, where so many Christians, especially young Christians, just aren't educated in Scripture, because there's no way you can read Christian Scripture and deny that Mary was Jewish. Even as Jesus Christ says in one of the Gospels, salvation comes from the Jews. So this radical revisionism for the sake of making it fit into contemporary political concerns is really, really dangerous.
One of the things that's really moving about your piece is that you are not numb to the plight of the Palestinians, especially those living in the West Bank. You visited the West Bank, you visited Bethlehem. You write movingly about the humiliation of the checkpoints, which anybody who's been there, as I have as well, has experienced firsthand, not like Palestinians, of course. What should the Christian approach to the Palestinian cause be in 2024?
Well, look, some Palestinians are our fellow Christians. And if you've been, as I have, to the West Bank and been with them, you know that they suffer. But you have to ask, why are they suffering? When I went to Bethlehem for the first time in the year 2000, anybody could go there except Israelis. But I was an American, I could go there. It was under Palestinian Authority control. And it was a free place, free movement, relatively speaking. Now it's not. Why is that? Because so many suicide bombers into Israel during the Second Intifada, I believe it was, started in Bethlehem. The Israelis had to protect themselves. So if we're going to feel sorry for the Palestinians and to try to understand their suffering, we have to understand where it came from. The Israelis didn't do this just to be nasty. They did this to save the lives of their own people from Palestinian suicide bombers. These weren't Christian suicide bombers, but how are the Israelis supposed to know that? Bethlehem was a Christian city. I should also say that so many Christians have left the Palestinian areas, not only because their lives are difficult, given the situation between Israel and the Palestinians, but because they're terrified of Hamas. We see a lot of propagandists talk about how, well, Israel is bombing Christians in Gaza. There are maybe 1,000 Christians left in Gaza because the rest of them have fled. When I was in Jerusalem for the first time in the year 2000, I talked to 2 young Palestinian men from East Jerusalem who said, yeah, we hate the Israelis. We hate what they're doing, but we're terrified of Hamas. And they told me, you can't write that. Our families will be in danger. I mean, this is a sort of perspective, Batya, that you just don't get in the American media. So many Americans want to impose our own morality on what's happening between Israel and Palestine, and it just doesn't work. It's just not true.
Do you feel that there's a sort of equal threat to young Christians, young people on the right as there is on the left? I mean, help us understand from your point of view where you see the real threat coming from. Should we be equally worried about both sides, and how do we fight this both on the left and on the right?
Yeah. Well, I think anti-Semitism is evil wherever it emerges. The attempt to de-Judaize Christianity is evil and a direct threat to the integrity of the Christian faith. I see it as more of a threat on the left simply because the left is the one that holds institutional power. Now, hear me clearly. I'm not saying that, it's okay if right-wing people do it. I'm just saying that the right-wing people who do it tend to be marginal figures. We have to stand up against it full-throatedly wherever it emerges. But let's keep in mind that among the progressive Protestant churches, that's where you're getting a lot of this, because they're bringing this de-Judaizing of the Christian faith. They're merging it with the activism, the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas activism that they're already engaged in. So watch out more for it on the left, because those are the people who have access to power.
Rod, thank you so much for joining us and for writing this wonderful piece. It's really, really a great read. Up next, Michael will sit down with Geoffrey Cain to discuss the political turmoil in South Korea this week. But first, if you have not already done so, please take a minute to subscribe to thefp.com so you won't miss a thing. And here is a message from someone who does just that. We'll be right back.
Jordy. I'm a healthcare technology design director. I subscribe to the Free Press. I live in Washington, D.C. My mom, she stumbled on Bari Weiss, her resignation letter from the New York Times, and I guess she saw an interview somewhere, and she's like, you have to watch this. The moment I watched it, I was like, oh my gosh, these are my people. I love watching Michael and Batya on the Free Press Live. Their banter is so fun to hear the different dynamics. I learned so much this year prepping for the election so that I wouldn't have a heart attack during the election, and it was really helpful. I feel like I had a lot more knowledge and context of things that nobody's talking about anywhere. What makes the Free Press unique feels like they're ahead of the game on conversations that eventually have been proven right months later, which has been really cool to hear it pop up in the New York Times or the Washington Post and be like, oh, I already know about this. The group brings really good perspective, but very honest. When folks disagree, they say they disagree, and it's not an emotional thing. It's very kind. And even towards the end of conversations, you see more of the overlap than you see the difference. And that's really encouraging for America, especially as we go forward this year. I subscribe to the Free Press, and you can too, at thefp.com.
All right, welcome back. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol issued an emergency declaration of martial law to quell his opposition, which he accused of sympathizing with North Korea and threatening the nation's democracy. He faced immediate backlash and large-scale protests. Take a look. Hours later, the president rescinded the declaration and now faces impeachment. Here to help us make sense of what just happened, because no one seems to understand, is Geoffrey Cain, award-winning foreign correspondent, author and scholar of East and Central Asia. Geoffrey, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Good to see you again.
Can I just ask the basic first question, which is, what on earth is going on?
That's a good question. Well, it is. It's a fluid situation still, where it's not totally clear what's going to come of this. What we do know now is that martial law has been lifted. I was a foreign correspondent in South Korea for many years. I've been to a lot of other countries, war zones, Ukraine, Israel, so forth. I did not expect, of all places, martial law to happen in South Korea. That caught a lot of people just completely blindsided. It was a shock. It was, it was dismaying to people, because it showed that the democracy of this country, this is one of the most prosperous democracies in the world now. It's really on a knife's edge. It's a success story that a lot of people don't know about, and yet the president was able to, at a whim, essentially declare martial law. It appears, I've been in touch with senior officials in Korea, They tell me that it appears to have been unplanned or relatively unplanned, an act of passion, something that he carried through with minimal notice. Many of his aides have come out. Lawmakers, I've been in touch with some lawmakers. They say that they had no idea that this was coming. And now the president's office has come out with a statement now that martial law has been lifted, saying that it was all kind of a social experiment. You know, he's pulled back, and he said that he just wanted to test their mettle. He wanted to see, he wanted to send a message to the opposition party that, they shouldn't mess with him. They shouldn't, they shouldn't divide and conquer the country, that they should, respect his authority. That's essentially the, reading between the lines, what the message was that he was trying to send. So it really is a bizarre situation. There's a lot more information coming in right now, and he is set to give a speech soon. We don't know when that's going to be yet, but very soon he's set to give a speech. He's expected to not budge. People are calling for his resignation. There's an impeachment bill going against him now, so he might be impeached, but he's expected not to budge, and he's expected to say, oh, well, it is what it is. I declared martial law, but just kidding, guys.
Yeah, the April Fools. Very strange. But I mean, as you point out, members of his own party were surprised by this. And, by the way, it's important to point out to people, and I hope you can fill in some of the details here, is that an amazingly prosperous country, especially compared to the dictatorship to the north. But it's a young democracy, isn't it? I mean, it's fully democratic since what, like 1986, 87, around there?
87.
I mean,
yeah,
87.
It's only been about 35 years, 87. South Korea is a young democracy. It's only been about 35 years that this country has seen the success that it has now. I mean, now it's the land of Samsung phones, of, K-pop, BTS, Gangnam Style. You rewind the clock just one or two generations, and it was an authoritarian military dictatorship. Yeah. It was extremely poor. Back after the Korean War, which was in the 1950s, it was one of the poorest countries in the whole world. It was poorer than Sudan, poorer than many sub-Saharan African countries. And it was written off by a lot of the global commentators historically as just a basket case. I mean, nobody thought it was going to get anywhere, but it's this democratic success story that proved all the naysayers wrong. This is something that the South Korean people are extremely proud of. I mean, you go there, and they are so proud of the democratic gains that they've made in their lifetimes, that they've made over North Korea, a mortal enemy that wants to destroy them. They're so proud of how far they've come. And to see the events of last night, to see martial law, just shows them, how fragile this success is. I mean, it turned out, it turned out okay in the end, but it was a race against time. This martial law was only overturned because enough members of parliament, enough voters in the National Assembly were able to show up at the chambers, vote. It was a 190-0 vote. They all voted against martial law. But if they had showed up just minutes later, the military might have been there first, and the military might have blocked them out. There were helicopters landing on the rooftops. The special forces were sent in. They broke a window. They got in. The National Assembly aides were stacking up furniture to block the military from getting in to stop the vote. It was just a sliver of time. And if this played out any differently, the country might now be under martial law still, and democracy would be wiped out. I mean, it would be wiped away, maybe temporarily, but the president would essentially be a dictator.
Yeah, I mean, the military shows up. I mean, they had their remit to arrest the leader of the opposition, right? I mean, that was the plan.
That's what it looks like. The way that the military was moving, they were moving into certain offices that suggested the plan was to arrest the opposition leader and a few other key opposition figures. It's just, I do go to South Korea a lot. I return to the country quite a bit. I still do a lot of reporting there. It's just, I've been in touch with a lot of old friends there who worked in the government, and they've always known that this is a possibility, but they never thought it could actually happen. It's one of those things, in the South Korean constitution, because South Korea was a military dictatorship, the president does have the power to set martial law, and he can do it at a whim. He doesn't need anybody's approval. He does need the National Assembly to vote on it after, but he can just do it whenever he wants. And that's a leftover relic of the military era in South Korea.
Yeah, I want to ask you quickly about the kind of casus belli here for this little mini war that broke out and seems to have ended in a day. When I was last in Korea working as a journalist, I was there just on a story, and we were trying to contact pro-North Korean groups because there are those that exist in the South. These secret police were on us immediately and had intercepted these communications. It was a big to-do. The reason given here by the president was that these people in Parliament, the opposition, are being controlled or have been infiltrated by the DPRK, by the North Koreans. Is that just, I mean, and I'm looking at this saying, is that really the argument here? And if that is the argument, is it true, even in a small way? And do people believe this? I mean, what is the kind of feeling you get about this?
It's not true. It's absolutely not true. Now, there has been a far left faction in South Korea. There have been various factions over the years that have been very friendly to North Korea. These are people, there was one lawmaker many years ago who traveled to North Korea to have her baby there so the baby could be a North Korean citizen. I mean, I
met with her, yes.
Oh, you did? Yes. I met with
a
lot of these people, interviewed them too. I didn't meet her. But there are these factions in South Korea that sympathize with North Korea because they see the North Koreans as their blood brothers. They have a shared ethnicity, their family ties. It's one nation that's been, unfortunately divided into North and South by years of war and strife. That's sort of how they see their country. But that is a very small faction. They used to be a lot more influential in politics. They've really been subdued, pushed aside. There's almost no reason to worry that, they would be able to show up in the South Korean government and instigate some kind of civil war or strife or assassinations or so forth. This is just the casus belli. This is the justification that President Yoon created to go after people who he doesn't like, because President Yoon, like many South Korean presidents, I mean, this is very common. This part's very common in South Korea. He's had a lot of shady dealings with family members. His wife has come under scrutiny for corruption. Some of his people are being impeached and attacked in the country's politics, and he wanted them to back off. That's what the picture is looking like now. So he took the most extreme option. He looked at that red button and he pushed it, and he said, it's martial law time. This has been entertained before. I mean, this is not the first time that something like this has happened. About 8 years ago, when I was last living in South Korea, the president then was being impeached. She was sent to prison for corruption. And there were documents that were leaked at the time that showed that there was a plan to have the military come in and quell or monitor protests. So, presidents have thought about pushing that red button before, but it's just so shocking that it went so far this time.
All right. Final question for you here is that impeachment proceedings have been launched from within Parliament. It seems I can't find anyone that seems to have supported this. I haven't seen anyone interviewed that has supported this. Maybe they've gone to ground because it's not a popular thing to support right now. But how likely do you think it is that he will be impeached? And then what happens after that?
He's toast. He handed the rope to the opposition party that they're going to use to hang him. They everything they need on him, and it's not going to be hard to get him out of office. The corruption allegations are piling up against his wife. There's a lot that's been going on in Korean politics recently, and in all likelihood, if the past pattern holds up, he might end up in prison. And if you look back, and a lot of people are surprised to learn this, but in South Korea, presidents usually go to prison at some point after their term is over. There's always a corruption scandal. There's always an investigation. And, of the past, during the Democratic era, almost every president has been either investigated or gone to prison at some point. One of them committed suicide during an investigation. But the last, two of the last three presidents have gone to prison. One last thing I want to say, this is the kind of thing to think about when it comes to democracies in general. I mean, even here in America, the president has a number of confidential emergency decrees that are from the Cold War era in case of a World War III situation. The president here has the power to do a lot to declare a national emergency. But these documents, these powers, many of them are still secret. There has been some written about them. Some freedom of information requests have come out that show what's been talked about within government circles. And allegedly, some of these powers include the ability to suspend habeas corpus, to suspend trials by jury, there's possibly an internet kill switch. The president can kill the internet. if things are not looking good. So, we've had one president in the past who was losing his capacities, who had to step aside from the election. We have another president coming in who is older than our previous president as he's starting. This is the kind of thing to think about in America too. When I look at South Korea and what's happened there, I get concerned for what could happen here, because we assume that, our democracy might be safe. I'm not saying this from any party line, it's not a Democrat or Republican thing, but it is true that the president here too has powers just like this, and at a whim can possibly instigate them.
All right, slightly depressing, Geoffrey. I hope that it doesn't happen here, and I hope that everyone would line up in front of Congress like the South Koreans did. Thank you, Geoffrey. We hope to have you back to fill us in on any developments in this story, but that is our show today. I want to thank Michael Knowles, Rod Dreher, and Geoffrey Cain for joining us, and thanks to everyone else for tuning in. Come back Friday for another episode of the Free Press Live. And if you haven't already, go to thefp.com and subscribe so you don't miss, because we'll tell you about it. And if you subscribe, I'll come back, because then they can pay my salary. All right, we'll see you on Friday. Bye.